A large portion of the book was defining a way to think about a problem. In other words, it's not a position, rather it's a family of positions, and you're very charitable. And the big puzzle of this to me is that the parent projects to these, like Carnap's or like Laplace's, seem to be nasty in a certain way, that they're trying to eliminate certain, like Hume, saying that philosophy that is not about things that are amenable to empirical inspection should be committed to the flames. That's sort of the father of all of these constructivist projects that were before yours, but yet yours is extremely non-reductionist, extremely generous, extremely I'm not going to settle here what kind of supervenience holds between mind and body and what needs to be included in the base. I'm just saying some kind of scrutability will work, sort of depending on whatever your philosophical commitments may be.
Yeah, so these views in some ways, in many ways, go out of the views of Rudolf Carnap, who is often caricatured as a logical positivist or somewhat more politely a logical empiricist. One of these people who tried to, reduce everything just to simple experience or to some reductive base and to deny the existence of metaphysics and culture and who knows what. I think it's a little bit unfair even to Carnap, but there's also an element of truth to it. But what I tried to do was take elements of the spirit of this project and sever it from the strong logical positivism of saying, this is all there is in the world, and allow arbitrary primitive things in the base. And just go with the idea there's some set of primitives about the world from which a full picture about the world can be derived. Now, for Laplace's demon, Laplace said that primitives about the world is just the positions of all the particles at a time and the laws of nature. From that, you ought to be able to predict everything. For Carnap, the primitives of experience. From certain facts about the logical structure of your experience, you can predict everything. Many people think neither project quite works, but maybe it's just their bases are too small. They didn't have enough primitives. Maybe if we throw some more stuff into the base, physics and consciousness and some other stuff, if you like, space-time and causation, then we have enough primitives to go on with. By allowing a bit more in the base, that's to some extent severing it from this strongly reductionistic base. That's why I call the project in the introduction Carnapian rationalism, as opposed to Carnap's own empiricism. It allows quite a deep structure for the world that we can know a priori, perhaps through the methods of metaphysics and philosophy, of which someone like Carnap might have been quite dismissive.
So scrutability, you just defined what a generalized picture of scrutability is, that there's some set of facts from which all the rest of the facts can be, well, I don't want to say derived, because that seems to be the innovation of talking about it in terms of scrutability, that it's not logical entailment. You're not saying that there's a set of basic facts that if we put these down, then through deductive reasoning, we can get the rest of it, right? There seemed to be some advantage in saying instead you use the Laplacian demon image, that if there was sort of an ideal knower that knew all the stuff that was in the base, then that knower could figure out a priori, right, without having additional experiences, because, say, the base could include stuff like the positions of the particles or things that we would get through experience. But if the knower knows stuff in the base, then it could figure out everything else. And there seemed to be some advantage of putting it in epistemological terms like that, rather than putting it as a straight matter of logical entailment.
Yeah, so the inspiration here is something like Laplace's demon. Laplace said, tell the demon the positions of all the particles and the laws of nature, and then nothing will be uncertain. The demon will be able to, for any hypothesis it's interested in, who will win the election tomorrow? Will it rain on Thursday? Will there be a third world war? Given that basic information about the particles, the demon can figure out whether that's true. So that's an instance of what I call scrutability. Laplace is saying that if the demon has all that physical knowledge, the demon can figure out anything at all about the world. Even from Laplace, I don't think Laplace had the idea the demon would figure it out through logic alone. Through logic alone, maybe the mathematics or the physics, the demon can figure out where the particles are going to be tomorrow, given the knowledge of the particles. But to move from the particles to questions about who wins the election, will it rain tomorrow, will there be a third world war, the demon needs to kind of step back and look at the world from a broader perspective and apply concepts like raining and elections and wars. I don't think you can do that by logic. Well, Carnap thought you could, because he thought you could define all those things in terms of the primitives. I'm skeptical of that project of trying to define things, ultimately in terms of definition. The approach I take is to sever all this a bit from the notion of logic and of definition, and instead do it roughly in terms of just what you could know. If you knew this, you could know that.
In this case, the knowing involves concepts in the base that feed into this. They may have a completely different source, but once you have those concepts in a base, then they would be the things you do your reasoning from?
Yeah, in a way, this scrutability relation connects different sets of concepts. So for Laplace's demon, the basic concepts were concepts of physics. Here are all the particles and their positions, and here are the laws of nature. Given all that, Laplace says you can know everything. You can know whether it's raining, who'll win the election. It's a certain basic set of concepts from which you can infer, in principle, any truths about the world using any concepts at all. And that's the sense in which it's a primitive base. You've got to be able to cross the level, if you like, from the primitive concepts in the base to the derived truths using any concepts at all.
So in the case of Laplace, you don't have to get too wound up about what you mean by particle exactly, right? It wouldn't matter if you had the particles be what we would think of as atoms now versus quarks later, as long as you had laws that applied to particles of that sort. You're not going to get too wound up about that.
I think Laplace actually said the fundamental constituents of nature, or the fundamental elements that make up nature, and he was neutral on what they were. Maybe he was thinking they were something like atoms or basic Newtonian particles, but maybe they could be quarks. Maybe in a contemporary framework of quantum mechanics, it could be a big quantum mechanical wave function. What's fundamental in the world is the wave function. And you could just use that and go.
I think you're right about the way Laplace himself would say it, that what you meant by these fundamental particles were things that had no constituents and weren't reducible to some other either physical structure, or they were fundamental in that way. They were not reducible. But I was wondering if that was a necessary condition. I guess this just goes to the question of what your sort of minimal base is and whether or not reducing it further makes it simpler, more desirable, and that's a separate judgment, I guess.
Or is there also an issue that, like in Carnap, it looked like you could have, because everything fits together logically, there's a certain amount of, it's just a matter of sort of what's most epistemically convenient as to what you're going to consider the base, that you could link every part of existence to every part definitionally. So while we can see the logic that he had for setting the phenomenal as the base, as you mentioned in your book several times, in fact, toward the end, he thought he could even just use purely logical concepts. But in any case, it seemed like there were multiple ways that which you call the postulates and which you call the axioms.
Yeah, I mean, in Carnap's book, it's called The Logical Structure of the World, and the ultimate aim was to get everything from just logic in the base. But for much of the book, he actually tried to get the world from experience, from states of consciousness, and he had this basic relation of phenomenal similarity among experiences that he started from. So many people have taken the book to be this sort of phenomenalist work, where we take the phenomenal or the experiential as basic and get things from there. But Carnap himself was actually a pluralist, and he says, I could have written the Aufbau. I could have written this book starting with a physical base instead of with a phenomenal base. And in fact, within 4 or 5 years, once he got to Vienna, he started moving very much from the phenomenalist perspective to the physicalist perspective and started trying to build things up from physical elements. And I think he's also inclined to think there are many other bases that would work as well. So I don't think Carnap saw himself as trying to limn the ultimate metaphysical constituents of the world. Carnap was just too anti-metaphysical for that. He thought there's just a bunch of different bases you can start with, and none of them is the absolute rock-bottom fundamental level of reality.
But the case there would be that to be bases in the way he's speaking of them, and I suppose the way you would speak of a scrutability base, is that they have to be transformable in some way from one to another. You may choose one as being more convenient or less convenient, but at the end of the day, because they at some level cover, then you're going to have to be able to have transformations in between them. That's
right. Your base has to be rich enough to be able to get everything out. Any truth about the world. If it's true that the cat sat on the mat, you've got to be able to get that from your base. If it's true that the quality of mercy is not strained, you've got to get that from the base. If it's true that God exists, you've got to be able to get that from the base. We want to be able to recover all of reality from our base.
Yep.
Yeah.
That will end up ruling out certain bases. In fact, some people think that Carnap's base was in fact too narrow. From a phenomenal base, you can't recover space and time and other things. That was Quine's problem. Some people think that a physical base isn't enough because you can't get to the mind. So your base absolutely has to be rich enough to be able to get all of reality out. But that's consistent with there being different bases. Maybe we can do it with the spatial and the experiential. Maybe we can do it with the causal and the qualitative. It could be there are multiple bases, all of which are rich enough to get out all of reality. And then there's an interesting question as to whether any of them are somehow the privileged base in the sense of, the fundamental level.
Now, if you don't already have a strong intuition about what the fundamental base has to be, it seems like the motivation behind most of these constructivist projects seems to me to be some kind of ontological parsimony, wanting to reduce, to make things simple. But given that you and apparently Carnap had a fairly flexible and generous spirit in light of ontology, can you describe what is the motivation then? Just everything fits together somehow?
Well, that's a great question. And for me, there's lots of motivations. And so metaphysical motivations are one among many. So you might think of this project as trying to get at the fundamental metaphysical constituents of the world and getting the rest of the world built up from there. And indeed, that's one motivation. For me, I'm more friendly than Carnap to the idea that there is a metaphysically fundamental level. And I talk a lot in this book about the thesis of fundamental scrutability, that all truths about the world are scrutable, can be recovered from the distribution of fundamental truths about the world in fundamental ontology. Now, for some people who are physicalists, fundamental ontology would just be the physical. For someone like me, who's more of a dualist, I think you need the physical and the mental in your fundamental ontology. So everything should be scrutable from there. But that's just one motivation. Motivations in metaphysics. There are also motivations in epistemology, thinking about, how much can we know about the world and what are the limits on our knowledge of the world. There are very strong motivations for me also in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mental content. That is, how do we understand meaning? How do we understand the difference between the meaning of Hesperus and phosphorus, something that Fregean talked about, or water and H2O? For me, this Scrutability project plays in a slightly complicated way into that project by allowing you to build up what I call an epistemological semantics. So it's actually got all these different motivations for me. I find myself thinking about the philosophy of language, and thinking about metaphysics, thinking about the epistemology, thinking about philosophy of mind with many different motivations, and they all converged on this central notion of scrutability, which is why I ended up having to write this big, rambly book that ends up trying to do a bit of all these things.
Well, and it's not even just one book, right? You're writing 3...
Oh, yeah, there's more coming.
Simultaneous.
Yeah. I had an idea to make promises like that in the introduction, but there's a book on meaning which is hopefully coming sometime before too long, and then maybe even one on possibility and necessity. I don't want to come out too close to each other. It's like, I've got to give the world a chance to actually read the first one first, but hopefully at some point.
You didn't pull a Heidegger for being in time and actually put a table of contents covering all 3 books in the first book.
That would be a really bad idea, I think. Yeah, that would really lock you in.
It didn't lock him. He just said, oh, well, I'm doing different things now.
Yeah.
You raised the point about Frege. So we had a whole Frege episode, and that was a mysterious thing to us, really how indifferent Frege was about about metaphysical matters, such that he didn't seem to care what these senses were. And that's what made subsequent philosophers of a more materialist bent, at least, so uncomfortable with admitting Fregean senses or something like that in the ontology, or we have to have like Russell's theory of descriptions or something that gets rid of these. But you had pitched Scrutability as one way of really making Fregean senses sound very sensible. In fact, we said Carnap, the reason he in the Aufbau had an extensional method was because the senses, the intention was too subjective. He was trying to do something that was straight up scientific. But the way that you describe your analog of the Fregean sense also sounds much less problematic. Let me try to phrase it and you can tell me if I've got it right, which is it that what you are giving in place of a Fregean sense, or a sense, maps a scenario, a real world scenario, onto a referent. So it maps a concept. So let's say we have the concept, I always use Clark Kent in Superman. So we have the concept Clark Kent, and in some epistemically possible worlds, for all we know, Clark Kent could be Superman or could not be. So you've got the sense Clark Kent, given a particular scenario, maps that concept Clark Kent onto Superman, given the facts of the world, something like that. What am I butchering there? Yeah,
in fact, this is an idea which I take from a different part of Carnap's work. The logical structure of the world came out in the late 20s, but in the late 40s, he wrote a book called Meaning and Necessity, where he really was one of the first ones to bring in this framework of possible worlds into thinking about meaning. And he really viewed it as a way to domesticate Frege's notion of sense. Frege had talked about Hesperus and phosphorus, Clark Kent and Superman. They've got the same referent, but different senses. But he never really taught us what senses were. Well, Carnap had an idea. Maybe they're intentions. And by intentions, he meant something like functions from possible worlds to extensions. So if the world is one way, Clark Kent is one thing. If the world is another way, Clark Kent is another thing. This comes out really nicely thinking about Frege's classical case of Hesperus and phosphorus. The sense of Hesperus might be something like the evening star. Carnap will model that as a function which in any given world picks out whatever is the evening star in that world. In our world, Venus is the evening star, picks out Venus. But hey, if things had turned out differently, Jupiter